One of the most beautiful things we have to photograph are sunsets and sunrises. They're always unique and they're available around the world. But not every day provides a killer sunset or sunrise, but they are frequent. It seems that many photographers and just plain cell phone users love to capture the beauty of the sun rising or falling. However, many do not know the best way to do this, end up with this washed out image, and they tell you, it really look a lot better in person. Well, there's a reason that it's washed out. I'm going to go into that and help you make killer sunsets and sunrises. These images that you're looking at right now are just sunrises that I've photographed the past couple of years. I'm really fortunate. I live in the foothills surrounding Las Vegas, and desert sunsets and sunrises are frequently spectacular. Partially I understand from the low humidity. I'm an early morning person. I'm usually up by 4 a.m., just kind of a byproduct of having a morning paper out as a kid. I just love the tranquility of the early morning, and I use this time to get up, get a lot of work done also. But frequently in the morning, I'll go out and I'll look to the east skies and see if I see some like high, wispy clouds out there. I think, oh, this could be a nice sunrise. So I'll grab a cup of coffee and head out to just a few miles from, like 2 miles from my house. There's a road that leads up to the mountains, and there's a lot of little side roads off of that with some really easily accessible spots that I can get a really killer view of the Las Vegas Valley. And it's good for both sunrises and sunsets. So I have an app on my phone that tells me the time sunrise and sunsets are, and also the direction of the sun at any given time or any given date. And there's a lot of these apps, but I'm currently using Sunseeker. I have a few more in there, but I usually hit Sunseeker first to see what's going on. And there's all kinds of online websites that will tell you what the sunrise and sunset is in any part of the country at any given date, time. So pretty easy to find out. So like if I'm using doing a sunrise, I usually like to get out in place, about 30 minutes before sunrise, because the sky is constantly changing, and you can just keep shooting and get a whole different look. And say every 10 minutes, sometimes it's totally different. So then next thing I do is I'm going to check my app, determine where the sun will be rising at. Now, the sun the place where it rises or sets isn't always the prettiest part of the sky. Sometimes it's totally behind you, 180 degrees behind you. But I do prefer to use a tripod, but don't always do so. Sometimes, like when it's cold, I'll just sit in my car and roll the window part way up and use that to stabilize the camera. But it's best to use a tripod. You're going to get a sharper shot that way. And it allows you to go to a lower ISO and a decent aperture. And I'll usually try and find something in the foreground, just like in landscape shots. Usually you want something interesting in the foreground. Now most of the time in a sunrise or sunset, whatever's in the foreground is going to be dark, but sometimes it creates a kind of a nice silhouette. I don't always do this, but I like to sometimes just for variety. But I usually get the camera set up and then kind of wait for things to happen. I usually plan on staying until the sun comes over the mountains on a sunrise. And I can't tell how many times I gave up on a sunrise. I thought, oh, well, doesn't look like this is going to be much. And I packed my camera tripod up and get in the car. And by the time I pulled the driveway, this sky is just blazing. So I've learned just, what, hang in there. I'm not very good at waiting. So sometimes I'm a real hyper type A person. So it's difficult for me sometimes. So, but I'm learning to do that, just to hang in there. So what you're viewing now are some sunsets that I've taken. Some of them from the same spot. I did the sunrise. I turn around and face the other direction. But a lot of them are different places around the valley. Now the main problem I find that most amateur photographers make in shooting sunsets and sunrises is shooting in one of the automatic modes. Unless you're using your spot meter and having the center of the camera view aim at the brightest part of the sky, you're going to have a washed out, overexposed sky. And you're going to lose that color saturation that you wanted. In my opinion, sunsets and sunrises are best photographed in a manual mode. I generally have my camera set to ISO 100 because that gives me the best quality. And then I also usually put my aperture at f8 or f11. That's usually the sweetest spot of your lens, giving you the sharpest photograph. Now this is totally possible if you're on a tripod. If you're hand holding, you might not be able to because you may have to go to too slow of a shutter speed and you're going to get camera shake. But having the tripod enables me to get a little better quality. So then I just aim the camera up, just going to aim it up the sky and fill the whole frame with the sky and set my meter to 0 then. And then I recompose the shot to show some foreground. Now, and basically I'm done because now I've got the exposure right where I want it. The foreground's going to be silhouetted, it's going to be dark. You know, if anything goes up in the sky, I should say it's going to be silhouetted. Everything else is going to go dark. But this isn't what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the sky. So if you meter the camera frame filled with the sky and the foreground, the meter is going to average everything out and try to bring in the dark background, which yields an overexposed sky. This is what happens because the camera's trying to, particularly if you're like in matrix metering on a Nikon or evaluated metering on a Canon or multi-metering on a lot of the other brands, it analyzes the whole frame and tries to render it 18% gray. So if it's trying to, not just too much dynamic range for any camera to pull in. And the sky is what you're interested in. You're not interested in the foreground. If you are, then what you're going to have to do is do an HDR, photograph, several different exposures, getting the foreground and then getting the sky and then putting it together and post. But, and I say you can put your camera on a spot or partial metering and make sure that that part of your lens that's reading the sky is just reading the sky, not trying to read part of the foreground. And then, the thing about digital photography is you get instant feedback. You take the shot, you look at it, go, oh, is that good? Sunsets, it's kind of cool when you sit there and, the sky's blue all day, and then at night, all of a sudden, as the sun goes down, it starts getting red and orange, yellow. You wonder where that comes from. Well, what happens is the sun is lower on the horizon, so when it goes over the horizon, the sunlight has to pass through more of the air, and then during the day. And when the sun is higher in the sky, the blue and violet light can come straight through the eyes, and it kind of takes over the stronger wavelengths of light. Now, if the path is long enough, all the blue and light scatters out of your line of sight, and the other colors continue on their way to your eyes. That's why sunsets are often yellow, orange, and red. The other afternoon, I noticed that there were a lot of really wispy high clouds to the west. And I know that this could lead to a beautiful sunset, so I looked at my sunset app and saw that the sunset was going to be around 4:26. But since it's going over the mountains, I know it's going to be earlier because I have these high mountains right to the west of me. So I drove up to one of my frequent spots. It must have been around 3:45, and I set the camera up on a tripod, as you can see here. And, I usually don't use two cameras, but I wanted to do a time lapse to kind of show you how much the sky changes over a period of time. So I did this time lapse that you're going to see here over 45 minutes. I set my camera to take a picture every 5 seconds, and then I put it Photoshop and made a little time lapse out of it. But you can see how it really changes rapidly. And so that's why I say you never give up on sunset or sunrise because you don't know what it's going to end up being. Now, if your camera doesn't have the capability of doing a time lapse, I'm shot this with a Canon 5D Mark IV, and it works really well and very easy to do. But you can get an inexpensive intervalometer to do the same thing. I mean, I'm talking like $50, and it's an easy thing to do. It's kind of fun. But the problem is when you're doing that is you got to lock the camera in one spot, and you don't always know if that's going to be the most interesting part of the sky that night. So I put my other camera with a 2470 on it, and so while my one camera's cranking away doing the time lapse, I take my other camera and I start looking at different spots in the sky and I this is kind of a normal thing where you get so much beauty around you. Like this is on the other side of the valley. This is 180 degrees, these shots from the sunset, because the light's reflecting all around to these clouds. And I just kept looking around for different areas and kind of waiting for the light to change. And this is kind of back where I was actually shooting with the time lapse. And then I zoomed in, I zoomed out, get a whole variety of shots. And you just find so much beauty around you if you just keep looking. And I use these shots for a lot of things. Here I was just shooting sky because I end up using a lot of these sunsets and skies, and I put them into the shots I'm doing. I Photoshop them in because I do a lot of real estate photography where I shoot exteriors of houses, or that's actually from the interiors. A lot of times I'll put these sunsets into the windows to add impact. So I keep a big catalog of these images around, and I love doing them anyway. But I will tell you, I'll confess that most of these I edit in Photoshop, and I kind of tweak the colors and the contrast, and can do so much with them. You know, learning how to use your camera is just part of the trick of getting really great photographs. The other part is knowing how to go in and edit them and enhance them and so forth. There's just so much you can do these days with them. And it's really kind of fun because there's times when I'll look at a shot and I go, well, maybe I can go in and do something to it. It just becomes alive. I'd like to show you the degree to which you can enhance a photograph in editing software. I'm using Photoshop CC here. This is Adobe Camera Raw. That's part of it. This is a way of editing raw files. Okay, so this is how the shot was recorded. This is came out as the defaults. Now, the first thing I do is come over and open up the shadows. See that? How that foreground starts to open up for me? And then I'm going to take the highlights down. What I'm essentially doing is widening my dynamic range. The dynamic range is, from the shadows to the highlights. And so by doing these, I'm basically, and since I have a raw file, all the information is there. So I can really work with them. And what I frequently like to do is take the blacks down, add a little contrast and punch to it. And then I'll check the whites and see how much I can get with them. I kind of do this to taste. Then I'll add the clarity, which kind of sharpens it, adds a little more punch to it. Then I'll take the vibrant slider, which basically enhances the secondary colors, not the primary ones that are in there. Take it over. So if I go too far, it starts looking kind of funky. But I want to do a little bit more to it. So I come up here and I take what they call the adjustment brush, and I'm gonna open up the shadows a little bit. Now, one thing I like about this is, see, I can come in here and do this. Now, this is too much as far as I'm concerned. So I go, okay, that just looks too phony. So I can come over here and say I can do anything I want to with this. Once I've done that, I can keep adjusting it. So I'm going to bring it to about like here. And then I'm going to make a new brush up here. And I'm going to make that a little darker. I'm going to take that down a little bit. So once I get it where I want it, I can say done. Now here's the cool thing about working in camera with raw files is I can go ahead and open this. When I open this, it'll take it into Photoshop, and then if I decide later, gee, I did way too much to it, or I want to do more to it, I can go back to this raw file, and the information's still there. There's no destruction. It's just all just like it was. So here's the before, a little bit kind of a washed out sunset. And then as I go in and do my little magic with it, here's the after. Greatly enhanced. You know, it may not be exactly what it looked like, but it made a beautiful photograph. So the problem with getting a great sunset photograph comes down to the limitations of your camera to capture the same dynamic range that the human eye can see. Now, the dynamic range is just the range of light from shadows to the highlights. The human eye, you can go outside and you can see detail in the shadows and also in the highlights at the same time. But the camera can't. They're getting better and better at it, but they do have limitations. So basically, you have to make a decision what's important in your photograph. And then when you're doing a sunset or a sunrise, obviously it's the sky. That's your subject, that's your star. You know, so you really want to set your exposure for that. Um, you know, if you rely on your camera to determine the exposure, it's going to usually render the sky overexposed because it's going to try and bring out detail in the foreground. Well, you know, sometimes you want that detail, but most of the time, what you're interested in is the sky. So there's, and if you're trying to do both, if it's really important that you have, you know, some detail in the foreground and the sky looking killer, then you can try several things. One is HDR software. It's called High Dynamic Range software. And there's a bunch of them out there. And here you take several exposures, and one that's good for the foreground, and one for the sky, and one in between. Then you put them in this HDR software, and it kind of brings out the best of each one of them so that you have detail everywhere. Now, this tends to look a little cartoonish sometimes, I think. And the second thing you can do is use a graduated neutral density filter. This filter is like, usually you have it on, it's like a square piece of glass, and it has this dark gray at the top, and then it gradually goes lighter and lighter and lighter until it's totally see-through. And so you put that in front of your lens and you look through and you drop the glass down into it until it darkens the sky, and so less light's coming through that part, and so it kind of uh, brings that exposure more in line with what's in the foreground, and that works pretty good. But you know, they're expensive, and who you don't always have that with you. Half the time you just got your camera. Oh, that's the sunset. Let's shoot it. So that's a good way to go if you're going to be a landscape photographer. Most of them will carry these with them. And the third is what I usually do, and that's to take several exposures, just like we did with the HDR. You know, take one for the foreground, one for the highlights, and maybe something in between. You know, most of your cameras you can set up what they call auto exposure bracketing, and so you can set it up like on my Canon 5D. I can take like bracket off like 5 images, so it'll take them 2 stops over, 1 stop over, then go all the way down to 2 stops under. So you can do it that way. Um, Not always necessary to have that many shots. Usually 3 will work. 2 stops over, 2 stops under, and one to what the meter says. And what I do then is I put it into Photoshop and I combine them. So I do what we call a layer mask, which kind of like knocks a hole through the dark one and brings in the foreground. So the shot here of Ravello, I did that way. I photographed the sky, then I photographed the village, and made the kind of shot I wanted. So that's a really good way to go. So here are my recommendations to get a great sunrise or sunset photo. First, meter the sky, and sometimes the sky looks better if you underexpose it. It gets you deeper, more saturated colors. So when you take the pictures, you know, point the camera up at the sky and get your exposure. Take a shot and see if it's dark enough for you, or maybe it's too dark, and then you would just adjust your exposure accordingly. Another thing is you don't want to have the horizon line in the middle of the image. That is just a compositional no-no. And don't center the sun or the bright area caused by, you know, as it goes over the horizon, it'll be a bright spot, and everybody seems to want to put that right in the center. Amateurs do anyway, and you basically want to have that off to the side. Makes it more interesting. And fourth, I always prefer to use a tripod. It's going to make you, it enables you to use a lower ISO and also use the sharpest aperture Usually it's a couple stops over the maximum aperture. So if you see you have a f4 lens, and it would be f8 or f11, somewhere around there is usually the sharpest part of your lens. So if you're in a tripod, you can do that. If you don't, if you're hand holding to prevent camera shake, then you're probably going to have to, go to a higher ISO and open up your aperture, let more light in. So, a tripod just usually results in a better image. And then the fifth thing you can do is work the image and edit the software. I totally recommend it. It's a lot of fun. You can take a kind of a mundane image and turn it into something pretty dynamic. Anyway, I hope you enjoy shooting sunsets and sunrises. It's